Hey, what's up, guys? You're now listening to Devo with Uncle Theo. Today is day 34, and we're going to look at Leviticus chapters 11 through 12. Now, one thing we mentioned is that we said to understand that God is holy, we must understand that He's holy on every single level. And so what we're covering right now starts to tease out what I mean by that. Well, in chapters 11 through 15, it opens up a new section of the book of Leviticus. We've got the priests ordained. We have the sacrificial system in place. And now we're going to start opening up to those holy preferences that I talked about that God is going to start commanding to the people. And in chapters 11 through 15, we're going to start to deal with some of that. And it's going to start to talk about various kinds of uncleanness and how both men and women are to be cleansed from them. So chapter 11 is going to differentiate between clean and unclean foods. Chapter 12 is going to deal with women and purification after childbirth. Chapters 13 and 14 is going to deal with skin and fungal diseases like leprosy. And chapter 15 is going to deal with bodily discharge. And so let's not lose sight of why we're studying this. And we'll pick that up even here in chapter 11. Let's read the purpose again. I'm going to grab this from verse 44 before we get into the clean and unclean animals. For I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourself therefore and be holy, for I am holy. And you shall not make yourself unclean with any of the swarming things that swarm on the earth. For I am the Lord who brought you up from the land of Egypt to be your God. Thus you shall be holy, for I am holy. Verse 46, this is the law regarding the animal and the bird and every living thing that moves in the waters and everything that swarms on the earth, to make a distinction between the unclean and the clean. And so this is the conclusion of the dietary laws. But we have to remember, let's not disconnect the clean and unclean, these purification rites. When we start to talk about things like leprosy, let's not put this in a category of its own and say, all right, I just need to learn this technical stuff. I just got to get through it. I just got to buckle up and get through it. And once we get through it, we can get back to the fun stuff. Don't think of it that way. Let's make this fun stuff. How is this fun? Man, Israel gets to learn about their God and how He wants them to operate and how He wants to separate them from other nations and how He wants them to love Him. So think about this. They get to learn that their God created this nation through one man. He set them apart. He's made them a great nation. He's taught them their purpose. He's taught them their language, and He's taught them how to have His presence. Israel is continuing to learn how to obtain and keep God's presence. We just saw in the last chapter how you lose God's presence when you offer strange fire. But now we're going to see how you keep it through ceremonial cleanliness. And so think about this. This is their language and this is their purpose. They're saying we are a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. This is what we look like as a priestly nation. And this is how we receive blessing from God in this system. And this is how we administer blessing to the world. And we teach the world that we're going back to Eden and we're going back to rest. And our creator is the true creator, not yours. And so when you see 2 to 3 million people marching around, stopping to set up poles, put curtains up, to make a tabernacle, to let God dwell in their midst, and then you see people constantly going in and out of the camp. Like, why are they going in and out of the camp? And we're about to start seeing that because they're not clean. They may do something. They may touch the carcass of an animal. They may do something unclean and they'll get put out the camp. And so if you're looking, and let me clue you in on, people would have spies back then. Just like Israel went to spy the land, people would spy on Israel. We'll see this with Rahab. She'll say, we know and we've heard what your God has done to the Egyptians. And so if you're viewing Israel, people going in and out, you see this tabernacle that looks like the sky and the trees and creation, and you're teaching the world that your God is the one true God. We treat food differently. We treat blood differently. we treat purification after childbirth differently. Watch us, look at us, and learn how to dwell with the one true God. And we actually invite you to join us. That's what the word proselytizing means. When you become a Jewish proselyte, you see what they're doing and you say, hey, I want part of that. That's Rahab. That's Ruth. That's Jethro. This is the purpose. So lock in and let's tie in, because this should be exciting stuff. Israel is learning their language as a people. And so chapter 11, first in verses 1-8, we get the land creatures. So it's going to be broken up just like, guess what? Creation. And so God is going to use language around land, water, and sky. So in chapter 11, verses 1-8, you'll see the land creatures. You'll get to see which creatures are edible and which are inedible, the unclean ones from the land creatures. Verses 9-12, we'll look at the water creatures. We'll see the edible ones. In verse 10-12, we'll see the inedible, the unclean, or the detestable ones. And the same in verses 13-20, we'll see the flying creatures. In verses 13-19, we'll see the inedible, the unclean birds. Then we'll look at the insects, the unclean insects in 20-23. And then 21 and 22, we'll look at the edible. So let's grab some of these. So let's start off the chapter with verse 1. The Lord spoke again to Moses and to Aaron, saying to them, speak to the sons of Israel, saying, these are the creatures which you may eat from all the animals that are on the earth. So we start to get what's acceptable from the land creatures. Verse 2, speak to the sons of Israel, saying, these are the creatures that you may eat from all the animals that are on the earth. Whatever divides the hoof, thus making split hooves, and choose the cud among the animals you may eat. This is verse 4. Nevertheless, you can't eat of these who chew the cud and split the hoof. You start to get a list of the animals that you cannot eat of. Let's look at this. The camel, for it chews the cud, it does not divide the hoof. It is unclean to you. Verse 5, likewise, the saffin, which is a small furry mammal that resembles a guinea pig, which is why the rabbit comes up next. It chews the cud and does not divide the hoof. And the rabbit also, it chews the cud and does not divide the hoof. Then verse 7, a pig, for it divides the hoof, thus making a split hoof, and it does not chew the cud. Then in verse 9, we move into water creatures. It says, whatever is in the water, all that have fins and scales that are in the water, you may eat. But if it does not have fins and scales, among all the teeming life of the water and among the living creatures that are in the water, these are detestable to you. So that's pretty simple. It's a no fin, no scale guideline. So that would rule our bottom feeders out. Our catfish would be considered unclean because they don't have scales. Let's move to the flying creatures. So under flying creatures, you'll get birds and insects. And so under birds, these are the ones that are abhorrent and not to be eaten. The eagle and the vulture and the buzzard and the kite and the falcon of its kind, every raven of its kind, and the ostrich and the owl and the seagull and the hawk in its kind. And we're going to shift to insects in verse 20. All the winged insects that walk on all fours are detestable to you. Yet these you may eat among all the winged insects which walk on all fours. Those which have above their feet jointed legs with which to jump on the earth. These of them you may eat. So these are clean insects. The locust and its kind, the devastating locust and its kind, the cricket and its kind, the grasshopper and its kind. But all other winged insects which are four-footed are detestable to you. And so the chapter continues to divide the clean and the unclean. And even in 29, you see the mole and the mouse and the great lizard of its kind, and the crocodile and the lizard and the sand reptile and the chameleon are unclean. And this would be Israel's job to learn and categorize all of these animals and memorize which ones God considers clean and which ones he considers unclean. And there's different violations for different sins. As we see in chapter 10, strange fire got 2 men killed, but touching an unclean animal, it says that you should be unclean until evening. This is verse 39. Also, if one of the animals dies, which you have for food, and one who touches it, the one who touches its carcass becomes unclean until evening. Now, in chapter 12, we continue to move into Israel being holy on every level, not just the grand levels, but the mundane, all the way down to purification after childbirth. And we see the introduction here in chapter 12, verse 1. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the sons of Israel, saying, when a woman gives birth and bears a male child, then she shall be unclean for 7 days. As in the days of her menstruation, she shall be unclean. On the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. Then she shall remain in the blood of her purification. For 33 days she shall not touch any consecrated thing, nor enter the sanctuary until the days of her purification are complete." Now we get a different timeline for female children. So let's look at verse 5. But if she bears a female child, then she shall be unclean for 2 weeks as her menstruation, and she shall remain in the blood of her purification for 66 days. So what we have here is the days are shorter for the male, one, logically, because God had already commanded that every male must be circumcised on the 8th day. And so God has to institute a law to allow for that. God isn't going to create a law that violates one of his other laws. He's consistent and he doesn't contradict himself. And some commentators say it's longer for the women, not in a misogynistic or a chauvinist way. It's pointing to creation and how the stigma around woman and her part in the fall, which is why the gospel undoes that. And it says in 1 Timothy 2, verses 13 through 15, that a woman shall be saved through childbearing. And what does that mean? It doesn't mean that women are saved through giving birth to children. And you probably won't believe this, but there's some groups that actually believe that women are saved through childbearing, and they have many kids. It's small sets. It's not very popular, but there have been people who have risen up that believe that women are saved through childbearing. And so we got to engage in accurate interpretation of that verse. And what I believe it means is, just like you see the stigma around woman and her part in the fall, God redeems that. She had a part in leading the human race into sin, and she'll have a part of leading the human race out of sin. God reverses the curse, and women get to train children. They spend the most time with children. They get to share the gospel the most, and they have their part in discipling and training children to Yahweh and producing, just like what he did in Israel. We are an anti-fall nation. And also, when the days of her purification are complete, for a son or for a daughter, she should bring to the priest at the doorway of the tent of meeting a 1-year-old lamb for a burnt offering, and a pigeon or a turtle dove, for a sin offering. So a sacrifice has to be made for the birth of a child. And he still institutes grace here, because in verse 8 it says that if she cannot afford a lamb, she can have 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. And this is what we see with Christ. In fact, God is even so gracious. We didn't pick this up in Leviticus 5, but even if you couldn't afford the turtle doves or the pigeons, someone of the lowest economic situation could bring flour as their sacrifice. As we wrap up here, what are we getting at? Remember, God is holy on every level, not only in the grand, but also in the mundane, which makes perfect sense why this would even carry over to us as believers when Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 10:31, whatever you eat or drink or whatever you do, do to the glory of God. What is Paul saying there? He knows of this sacrificial system, And God has his hand on the most grand things like birth and death, and even the most mundane things like leprosy and bodily fluids and unclean and clean food. And our encouragement today is to know that God desires to be treated as holy on every level. So let's glorify God in all that we do, no matter if it's a grand act. And here's the catch. We don't get many of those. In our lives, if you could count, you can count on less than both of your hands how many grand acts you will experience in life. We're mainly going to experience the mundane. And so let's prepare well for that, and let's glorify God on every single level, and let's be holy and treat him as holy, for he is deserving of our love and affection. Let's be holy, for we have a God who is holy. And to update that language to Paul's language, let's be imitators of Christ, because there and there alone is the only place where holiness is found. You take care, guys, and I'll catch you tomorrow for day 35.